go. Hi, I'm Farha and I'm the Heritage Manager at Toynbee Hall, and we're joined by Shavena, who's the Youth Participation Officer here, and John Walker, who wrote this incredible book called Out of Sight, Out of Mind. The book focuses in on a piece of local history, specifically children workhouses and the Forest Gate District School. And in the book he talks about the phenomena of these workhouses, their conditions, their challenges, and also the move to reform them, which actually involves Toynbee Hall's very own Henrietta Barnett, one of the co-founders of our organisation back in 1884, who was who played a principal role in some of that reform of the workhouses. So we're going to be in conversation today where we're just going to ask you some questions.
Thank you,
and chat a bit more.
Thank you, Farha. I'm looking forward to it very much.
Good.
Hi, John.
Hi.
Thanks for joining us here today. Yeah, I guess I just wanted to start with setting the scene in terms of where these kind of workhouses emerge, and how these kind of conditions become.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm absolutely delighted to be with you today. The book is about essentially a children's workhouse. Now, where did workhouses come, or how did they emerge? Now, traditionally in Britain, going back to the Norman conquest in the 11th century, the church has always been the organisation that was expected to and did look after the local poor, the local disabled, the local elderly, the local sick. And it was a traditional charity function in the old, going back to the pre-Middle Ages. But people would go to abbeys, they would go to monasteries, sit outside and beg or get alms. So they would be given food, they would be given sustenance and so on. And local communities would know poor people, and it wasn't really a huge issue. The church was powerful, the church was, in all of its variations, very wealthy, and it fulfilled that function. Fast forward to the 19th century, three major things were happening almost simultaneously. There was a huge drift towards the towns because the agricultural revolution changed conditions in the countryside, which led to an awful lot of rural unemployment. People had nowhere to go, so they drifted to the towns. The transport revolution, which brought along canals, railways, turnpike roads and so on, enabled people from the countryside to move to the towns. And the Industrial Revolution, which I guess most people know about, led to the growth of factories and the growth of towns. So in the early years of the 19th century, there was this huge drift of people into towns. Towns really weren't able to cope with the enormous increase in the numbers of people that moved in. And although they weren't moved in for work, they weren't jobs as we know them today. Everything was very casual. You got half a day's work here, maybe a couple of hours every other day. And there wasn't decent housing, there wasn't decent sanitation. There were no local authorities as we knew them. And so enormous slums built up. There was desperate poverty. And local churches were unable to deal with the huge numbers of people that turned up on their doorstep. So the state intervened, and to cut a long story short, from the 1830s onwards, there was a huge expansion of workhouses. Now these were places where people were accommodated who didn't have the means to look after themselves because they were unemployed, there were no state benefits at the time, they had no work, they had no food, they had no money, and the state provided these workhouses. Now, the feeling at the time was, if you don't have the means with which you can look after your family, it's because you're lazy. Basically, there's work for anybody who wants it. it's your fault, you're indolent, you're no good, that's why you end up in a workhouse. If that's the case, we are going to make conditions in the workhouse absolutely dreadful. And they called it the less eligibility criteria. In other words, they made things worse in the workhouse than they could be outside as a deterrent for people seeking this kind of accommodation. So, given the fact that there's only dreadful slums outside, given the fact that people had almost no food, how could they make conditions worse for them in these institutions? Well, they humiliated people. They put them in dreadful conditions, dreadful accommodation. They made them wear drab uniforms. They separated men from women and families from children from their parents. They made them do absolutely dreadful drudgery work, almost like prison work, breaking stones, doing terrible things, and generally humiliated these people. All with a view to making it a deterrent to prevent people from going to the workhouse. Some of these workhouses became enormous. Whitechapel, where we're sitting today, grew enormously in the middle of the 19th century, and part of that was that they had a huge workhouse. They had lots of people who drifted into East London from Essex, from Suffolk and so on, looking for work. There was no work, or there was no work that was going to sustain families. So they ended up in a huge workhouse in what is now Valence Road. And from the 1850s onwards, the people who were running the workhouse, the so-called local poor law guardians, decided they were going to set up a separate workhouse for children, to take the children away from their parents, who they felt were feckless, were only going to give them bad ideas, and built an institution about 7 or 8 miles away from where we're sitting now, in Forest Gate, which was in the middle of the countryside, the middle of the Essex countryside. It may seem strange today, but here it was a completely rural environment. The idea was, we'll build this institution here, shove all the kids in there, they're away from their parents, we'll try and teach them to be better citizens. The buildings exist today. If you look out, strain your neck on the train going to Liverpool Street, halfway between Forest Gate and Maryland Station, the buildings are still there. It's now social housing and performs another function that perhaps we'll talk about later on. And kids were shoved in there. They were taken away from their parents from the age of 2, no consent required, and put there. The children were separated, siblings, by gender, by sex, boys in one section, girls in another, the under 7 somewhere else. They were there from the age of 2 to the age of 14. If they were lucky, they'd see their parents for a couple of hours every 3 months, and they were treated as brutally as their parents were, really, in the workhouses. Dreadful food. The place was run by, we say, ex-army sergeant major types who believed that the kids needed a bit of knocking around to instill a bit of discipline in them. There was nothing that we could vaguely consider to be childcare, nurturing of children, trying to encourage the development of young, exciting minds. They were given drudgery, dreadful jobs to do in the workhouse, in the workhouse school. And that was running from 1850 to 1907. But there were some significant interventions very relevant to the building we are in here today. So
sure, and I think we'll go on to that in a bit. So I guess, maybe we can talk a bit more about the people who run these institutions.
Yeah, this is an era before local government as we know it, really, and before state benefits, the welfare state as we know it. And so the workhouses were run by people called poor law guardians who were elected locally, but only by landowners or property owners. Now, by and large, the landowners and property owners themselves were never likely to end up in the workhouse by definition. They were reasonably well off. And so there was always a choice at an election time as to who they would vote for, and maybe people might see parallels today. But on the one hand, there were candidates who were running it who were saying, vote for me and we'll make conditions decent in the workhouse, but it'll cost you increased taxes. And other people saying, well, these are a bunch of no good, feckless, no gooders. We want to make them suffer. We don't want to give them decent conditions at all. In fact, we're going to drive down taxes so much to make them suffer. And surprise, surprise, it was the kind of people who wanted to pay next to no tax to make conditions in the workhouse and in this school as dreadful as possible, who ended up being the governors, or being the guardians and the governors of the school. So all of this, the fact that these people were seen as were marginal to society, they didn't have jobs, there was no state to support them, they didn't have an income, they couldn't afford food, they lived in slums or on the streets. That was then compounded by the fact that the local solution to that was to treat them almost as criminals. And these workhouses were very, very similar to prisons in the way in which they operated. There's a well-known Canadian historian, a Canadian sociologist called Irving Goffman, who in the 1960s developed this notion of a total institution. Basically, it's somewhere where you are incarcerated, locked up for 24 hours a day, and your entire world is dominated by that institution. And typically, prisons are total institutions, maybe monasteries, maybe nunneries, but people enter those voluntarily. And workhouses were the same. So the people there had a closed view, they were shut off from society, and very often when they were released on that, they had difficulties in coping with society because they'd been institutionalised. So those were the people who ran it, that was the impact it had on people who were in them. And many people, when they left the institutions, maybe similar to people who leave prisons today, struggled really to cope with what the rest of us would call freedom, but it's just almost an alien society in which they were cast. It was just that way for the adults in the workhouses, and for many of these children in school. They were there from the age of 2, suddenly at the age of 14, having been incarcerated, go and join the world. How on earth were they supposed to do that? They hadn't been socialised. They didn't know what society was like. They hadn't been cared for. Is it surprising that so many of them struggled when they left this school, this institution?
Okay. So we've heard a bit about the conditions and the people that are running them. And so who were the kind of key players with kind of raising awareness of that and pushing for that to kind of change?
Well, I should add, in terms of, I'm trying to describe the conditions in which the place was run.
Mm-hmm.
They were compounded by the fact that all of the key personnel, the employees, the superintendent, the person who ran the institution, were ex-army sergeant major types who
Mm-hmm.
felt that all these children needed was a good bit of discipline, a good bit of square bashing, knock them into shape. There was no notion of childcare. There was no empathy. There was no love, consideration, understanding. Children were brought up in these brutal conditions. A couple of women emerged in the 1870s, and the fact that they were women is significant. The first was a woman called Jane Senior, who was Britain's first female civil servant. She was given the job of examining conditions in these children's workhouses, and she said they were absolutely appalling. They needed to be reformed. Children needed to be treated as young human beings, to be nurtured, to be empathised with, to be loved, to be cared for, to be turned into fine future citizens. She was pooh-poohed by all the men surrounding her. But this is sentimental folly. These kids need a strong arm, they need a bit of discipline, and then they'll be okay. They won't be like their feckless parents. So her message nationally was unheard. Locally, very, very locally, in Whitechapel, which ran this children's workhouse, a couple of people moved in the 1870s. Samuel Barnett and his wife Henrietta. They were both middle-class people, upper middle-class people, very well connected, but very socially concerned. Samuel Barnett was a vicar, and he moved into St Jude's Church, which is next door to where we're sitting now in Toynbee Hall, where the Canon Barnett Primary School is now based, and his wife Henrietta. They were both, and you know, it would be very easy for them to be dismissed today as do-gooders or whatever. They regarded themselves as Christian socialists, and they said to the Bishop of London, we want to work in the poor, among the poorest in the country. And he sent them to Whitechapel, which he said was the worst parish in his diocese, full of criminals and unworthy people. The church, when they got here, didn't have a vicar. It had been effectively closed for 4 or 5 years. So they went in and they started to try to change things. And okay, it was very top-down, very middle-class, very paternalistic, very philanthropic. In many of the ways that were typical of the time and typical of the approach, because among other things, they initiated and developed this wonderful institution that we're in today and that survives 100 years later. Henrietta was appointed the first woman governor of one of these children's workhouses anywhere in Britain, the first woman school workhouse governor. She tried to change things through the institution of the Board of Governors. They were all men, and you know, this is an anti-man rant, but they were not empathetic to the children there. They were the same poor law guardians who were interested in saving money on the rates and not spending money, you know, believing that a bit of good discipline was all these kids needed and so on. She got nowhere on the governing committee, so she went behind the backs of the governors and did stuff in whatever way she could. So the great lesson from her, not to be put off by institutions that said no. She found her own way of affecting change. She got her friends involved, coming to see the kids, reading them stories. She was able to take some of the children, some of the young girls and teach them properly how, as trainees, how they might become domestic servants, which was the most likely occupation they were going to have. She introduced an organisation of aftercare for these young girls, many of whom left the school at the age of 14 and fell into disreputable hands as domestic servants, where they would be financially, physically, sexually, emotionally abused and just lost. Henrietta Barnett established an aftercare organisation that kept an eye on them until they were 21. And she got loads of her middle-class friends to keep an eye on some of these children. She was well connected, she sought patrons all over the place. So she established the idea of a children's countryside holiday fund to get kids out of the school, have a fortnight in the countryside once a year as a holiday. So well connected was she that she got one of the Queen's daughters, Princess Beatrice, to be the patron of this. That got money and it got the kids out. So the great thing I would learn from today's lesson from Henrietta Barnett is she wouldn't take no for an answer. She found ways and means of doing things to effect change. She nibbled away an uncaring institution and bit by bit was able to humanise it, make conditions better for the kids.
Your book, you've given kind of a really strong overview of workhouses, children workhouses generally, and Henrietta Barnett's involvement, but your book does focus in on one specific one, the Forest Hill District School, and kind of the the way in which Henrietta Barnett and others pushed the boundaries for social reform in that specific institution. It'd be great to hear a bit more about that, and then how that affected kind of on a national level policy.
Right, do you want to ask me a question?
Yeah.
So she nibbled away and improved things bit by bit, and undoubtedly, the kids got books to read, they wandered out, they got a holiday now and again, they were perhaps not as badly brutalised. She was really pleased with the fact that she actually got those running this school to call children by their names rather than by numbers. So, but she came to the conclusion that all of this stuff that she'd done was great, but it was the culture, it was the institution that was wrong, it was the way in which it was managed that was wrong. And she was able to get national campaigns to try and close the schools down because they were unfit, they were unhealthy, they were uncaring. And she left as a governor in the school in the mid-1890s and was immediately replaced by two working class men who until that time were completely unknown, one of whom himself had been a child brought up in one of these working class, in one of these children's workhouses, a man called Will Crooks. The other of whom was a local member of a socialist organisation called the Social Democratic Federation, a man called George Lansbury, who many of the viewers may have heard of. These two men were local from Poplar, working class men who, because of slight changes in the election procedures for boards of guardians, became two of the very first working class guardians in the country to become elected as working class and as guardians, poor law guardians, and both got involved in running this school in Forest Gate. And they said, these conditions are intolerable. We cannot bring our children up this way. Crook said, I was in an institution like this, and it's burnt forever in my mind. The day I walked in there, I was separated from my brother. I didn't see him until I walked out. We were treated dreadfully, we were treated brutally, we were given appalling food, there was no care. And from the moment I set in, it was my lifetime's ambition, my lifetime's mission to change that. He got elected as a poor law guardian of Poplar, and he, with Lansbury, the two of them transformed that school. They closed it down and sought huge sums of money in order to build a much more acceptable institution, which they did in Essex, a place called the Hutton Poplars. So instead of this massive barracks, 900 kids in one huge institution, they were able to find money, to twist arms, to raise the money to build a number of houses, not run by sergeant majors, but with house parents, mothers looking after essentially their stepchildren or orphanages. So for the first time, to inject some genuine female compassion, some genuine care, some genuine understanding. And this really, from 1907 onwards, set the standard for public institutions for looked after children in Britain, whether they were orphanages, whether they were poor law schools or whatever, for probably the next 70 years. Looking back today, through our own eyes today, they weren't great, but they were an enormous change on previously. The kids went to local schools, mixed with ordinary other kids in the local schools, rather than being stigmatised as wearing this dreadful uniform, almost like prisoners. They mingled in the local community, rather than being locked in behind these walls as prisoners would in a prison today. They were able to learn proper trades, so that when they left school, the girls might be a milliner or a tailoress or something, the boys might be a plumber or a carpenter rather than just trained simply to scrub floors and peel potatoes. So they were actually given the basis of a loving, caring upbringing and given real skills in a social setting that enabled them to become fully upstanding citizens when they left the institution, something that had been denied their predecessors at this school in Forest Gate for the last 50 years.
I think that's super powerful to hear kind of how is like, you know, certain individuals in positions of power being able to empathise and recognise that this isn't the right conditions for children and kind of advocating both on kind of a grassroots level but then also to affect national policy is really powerful. But some of the language that you're using feels really, what's the word, like, oh, I feel like I just heard that yesterday.
Right.
When you're talking about kind of like that approach that's taken, whereas army officials kind of governing these workhouses, and it's about kind of them pulling themselves up and almost criminalising them, or the dehumanisation process of these children kind of, I feel, really mirrors kind of contemporary society's language used to talk about, say, still working class communities, but also other communities that are on the margins, such as refugee children, people claiming asylum, migrant communities. And I wonder, and I put this to you, Shavena, as well, as like, how do we, there's this successful campaign that happened 100 years ago, but we're still hearing that rhetoric today, and we're in Tower Hamlets, in Toynbee Hall, in which this is still a borough where I think 1 in 3 children might not be eating tonight. So how do we marry that? Like, that there was this really successful campaign, but also these issues are still existing for working class communities, working class children, but also other communities on the margins.
Okay. So do you want to ask me a question, or should I just talk on?
Yeah, just go for it, yeah.
Okay. So the lessons for today, I guess, from all of this were, well, it was, looking back, it was kind of top-down stuff, I would guess, that led to those changes. But the important thing is that, if we look at Will Crooks, it was his own experience that drove him to make those changes. He dragged himself up, he became he got elected, and he was enabled to do that. Lansbury was fairly similar. So, you know, there are mechanisms that people can use to effect change through structures, but equally, if you take your foot off the pedal, reactionary forces or forces forces that aren't interested in change will dominate. And so if we look today, you know, unless there's continued pressure for change, marginal communities, marginalised communities will continue to be marginalised. There will always be people who are treated worse because of their social status. A combination of people who will speak up on their behalf, but more importantly, people from those communities themselves who self-organise, who articulate, who make their discontent at their disadvantage very, very clear, are going to be in the best positions to effect social change. It's people speaking from within who can do that. People can come from without, sprinkle a bit of fairy dust and then breeze on as they go on to their next project. There's nothing wrong with that, but if you live day to day in intolerable conditions, it's you who are most benefit quite clearly, but are most in a position to articulate in whatever way you can how awful those conditions are, and to pressurise and to effect the change that you need, that you know more than anybody else is necessary in order to address that disadvantage.
Shavena, do you have any reflections?
Yeah, I mean, I guess we've talked about how within kind of structures people have been trying to create change, but also I think with Henrietta Barnett trying to find ways outside of and reject, and even when their ideas are being rejected by the institution and the state, trying to find ways to kind of account for that. But then also thinking about how, this issue continues to be one, and so the conditions of marginalised people hasn't really changed over time, right? And so we should be thinking, why is that? Why is that in this day and age? I think me and Farha, we've spoken before about how, with Toynbee is trying to tackle poverty, but over 100 years we're still living in a borough which is experiencing high levels of poverty. So I think there's some big questions to be asked as to why these conditions still exist, right?
Whilst also side by side in extreme wealth. Like we have the City of London right next to us, and our the borders between Tower Hamlets and City of London are kind of literally right by Toynbee Hall, and it feels like that's kind of a similar dynamic of that time, where actually those who were running the children workhouses and the general workhouses were people of wealth, dictating that structure, I suppose, and kind of keeping people in those conditions.
Well, it's tempting to say it's always been that way, and any look at British, I know a bit about British social history, and I know less about social history elsewhere, but I know enough to know that change overwhelmingly comes from pressure from the bottom upwards. Effective change to affect and benefit those who are most disadvantaged comes by the energising, the organising of the disadvantaged communities. You can't rely on patronage, you can't rely on people with the best will in the world coming along and doing good things, because those people move on. The people who are forever on the margins, beyond the margins, are those in the best position to organise. And unfortunately, that's the nature, has been the nature of society in this country for hundreds of years. If you look to conditions in America, you look to conditions elsewhere in Europe, it's not vastly different. Wave after wave of migrants into the US, as indeed it has been perhaps less dramatically in this country. The new wave of immigrants is often at the bottom of the social pile, and it's only by organisation within those communities that change to benefit those communities can take that happens, and that those communities can survive and prosper. By sitting doing nothing, the rest of society isn't going to do a great deal, and in fact we'll probably get quite antagonistic about people at the bottom of the pile.
I think there's some interesting stuff said there. I think as well is that thing of like when people in the grassroots organising, which is incredibly powerful, and they are coming from a lived experience and definitely in line with kind of the values of the When We Speak programme, and also recognising to not be constantly agitating and organising is okay too, because when you're coming from the margins, your experience is actually quite draining and exhausting, and just to survive and just by existing, actually you're doing existence as resistance, right? So recognising that even if you're not on the front line agitating and organising, that doesn't make it that you're doing nothing, because just by surviving quite a hostile environment is in itself something.
Exhausting.
And that in itself is something for sure. I think in terms of this example, Henrietta Barnett isn't on the margins. She is a middle-class woman who has used her power and leverage and her network and her resources to affect change. And then obviously a little bit later, George Lansbury and William Cook's coming in and also making that kind of systematic change within there. So would you say, would that have happened? Would George Lansbury and Will Crooks have had the space to do that had Henrietta not been involved? Or was that a intervention that, had it happened or not happened, would have still led to the end result? If that makes sense.
Well, it's a sort of slightly structural thing, really. I mean, Lansbury and Crooks were both only able to become poor law guardians because the eligibility criteria for election to be become a poor law guardian had been changed so that people on lower incomes were able to stand and get elected. So, to take a national parallel, until the 1830s, only the very rich, were able to vote, and it wasn't until the 1860s, or effectively 1884, when 50% of working class men had the vote. No women at all had the vote in this country until 1918. So it's once the disadvantaged communities are able to articulate through the political process that they were able to organise it. So it was only when working class men had the vote that the Labour Party, for example, was able to emerge. I'm not making a statement on behalf of the Labour Party, but with no working class representation in party, with no working class people eligible to vote, it's entirely unlikely. In fact, it didn't happen. A Labour Party to articulate the views of working class people would not have emerged. So I think the point is that all communities need to use, and whether it's Henrietta Barnett using her mates to effect change, whether it's working class people using political institutions to make change, whether it's marginal communities using community group pressure to make change. I think if you wish to effect change for the better, you need to be broad-minded and use whatever tools are available to you. In some circumstances, working class communities by and large can't phone up the son of the Queen and say, can you become patron of our organisation? So you need to find other means to try to effect that change. Lansbury and Crooks were able to do it because they got elected. Other people, other organisations have been on the streets, have been able to articulate. Women's suffrage came in this country as a result of agitation by women, very public displays of political statements before the First World War and activity during the First World War led to women's suffrage affecting change. I think it's down to people to use whatever resources there are available to them. And if we look at this children's workhouse, for example, Henrietta Barnett, exceptionally well connected, used her mates, used her influence, used social connections, and went a long way. As she went out the back door of this school, because her term of office had finished, in through the front door came two working class men. They used the electoral, because there'd been changes in the eligibility to stand as local guardians for the boards of guardians that ran workhouses. They were able to use the electoral process. They got elected, and through that they made their change. Other people who are denied the electoral process have made change in other ways. Almost simultaneously, when Crooks and Lansbury were effecting change via the electoral process at this school, women didn't have the vote in the country at all. Women took to the streets, suffragettes, the likes of Sylvia Pankhurst, a friend of both Crooks and Lansbury, that made a huge impact, campaigning publicly and openly, civil disruption, civil disobedience, got enormous publicity. That was their way, and women got the vote. Today we have huge possibilities for people to articulate themselves that were inconceivable even 20 years ago. Social media, YouTube, where I hope you're watching this, all sorts of other devices, TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, goodness knows how many. People are able to find an audience, to articulate, to organise, to get their views across, to effect change in a way which was inconceivable even 20 or 30 years ago. Those are the weapons that people, in my view, should seize today to effect change. So as time goes on, if you want to change, look around. What can you use? What powers are there available? What is accessible to you to effect that change? And over the last 150 years, I think all of those devices have worked. Who knows what it'll be in 30, 40 years' time? But everybody has the ability to try and do something with the resources at their disposal. It's less easy, it's more difficult if you're on the margins, if you're in a disadvantaged community, but there is something there. Use it.
I think that's a really powerful and important message. I guess I wanted to maybe bring up a bit about, I guess we're hearing these narratives and these stories that we're telling are kind of from the people, the more kind of influential people who were part of kind of running these institutions. And something you talk a bit about in your book is having that lack of voice of the children that were part of the institutions. And I was wondering about how the kind of difficulties of trying to uncover the lived experiences of these children.
I mean, it's incredibly difficult. Throughout history, by and large, history has been written by the victors of things. So battles are written by generals. For many people, certainly my generation, history at school was about kings and queens and goodness knows what else, and empire and all the rest of it. The bottom-up approach is only very, very recently that people have wanted to listen to what people on the grassroots, people at the bottom have wanted to hear, have had to say. The history of colonialism has all been written from what happened in Whitehall and how things were manoeuvred in Whitehall. Very little from the experiences of people who were the victims of imperial Britain and so on. So, and it's difficult getting access to those records because by and large the underdogs weren't articulate, didn't have the resource, didn't have the ability to, or didn't have the resources to get their thoughts published, haven't left the records. But records do exist, and thankfully there are some wonderful institutions where you can find out this kind of stuff. That's where I got a lot of the information in here. Some of them not very far away from here. An absolutely fantastic place. A 10-minute walk from this organisation is the Bishopsgate Institution, where the library there, they've got wonderful resources. We can find out about the histories and background of this area. Again, 10 minutes on public transport, you're at the London Metropolitan Archives, where I found a great deal of the information that's in that's in my book. So it requires a bit of digging, it requires a bit of time spent in libraries, which I accept isn't everybody's cup of tea, but dig and dig and dig, and you can find out stories from the people who, until fairly recently, have not been heard.
Okay, thank you. I guess the last question I wanted to ask was, kind of linking back to the fact that you mentioned at the beginning you're from East London, and just thinking about why you decided to delve into these histories and your personal connection to.
Well, I regard myself as a bit of a historian, really, and I've run a blog on Forest Gate history for a number of years. The buildings of that school still exist. It's social accommodation. It's accommodation largely for key workers in the NHS, and it's a lovely looking building. And I'd always been curious about its history. I'd written bits and pieces before, but I always knew there was a story there, so I just wanted to delve into it. And on a slightly more personal note, some of my family, my ancestors have lived were in workhouses, spent time in workhouses. My mother I was brought up for a while in an orphanage, and I was quite keen really, and it's the sort of family historians you ever talk to always say they always wish they spoke more with people who are no longer with them to find out the conditions. And so this was my kind of route into trying to find out a bit about possibly some of the conditions in which some of my ancestors lived in. So, you know, a combination of living close to the building, having an interest in its history, having an interest in social history generally, and a bit of curiosity about how could it have been for my predecessors, led me to start digging around. I found it a fascinating journey. As I said to you, I spent a lot of time in the Metropolitan Archives, the National Archives, newspaper libraries and so on, which I find incredibly interesting. I accept it's not everybody's cup of tea, but if you are interested, it is there. Please go for it. You can find out enormously interesting things about your own families, your own communities, your own histories.
Sure. Do you want to say?
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much for sharing a little bit of your research with us, the kind of the history of this this particular school workhouse, and connecting it to kind of like other strands that are relevant today. I feel like we could also just like deep dive and talk about a few different things, just even what you mentioned right now. Thinking, and I think we talked about this in an earlier conversation that wasn't recorded, but also thinking about like history and documentation and archiving, and kind of these are actually like long-standing processes that have existed for a really long time, shaped by the victor or the dominant culture, the dominant community, and perhaps what work needs to happen to these processes to reimagine them so that they can hold space for the lived experiences to exist within these structures, and be able to be documented, so that we you know, the challenge that you had with finding the children's voices, you know, in the future isn't as challenging. That's almost like a whole other conversation and question, but I wonder if there's anything you want to say to that.
Well, just that you know, there are attempts all over the place actually to try to address that deficiency now. And you know, there are lots of very interesting oral history projects where people are interested in hearing the stories of, and documenting and archiving the stories of parents, grandparents and so on, to get the real feel for how it was 70, 80, 90 years ago. Unfortunately, the very nature of oral history requires living people to tell their stories. We can't dig up people from 250 years ago and get them to tell us, but I would urge people to have a concern about heritage, whether that's local physical heritage or the heritage of the communities that they are from, to immerse themselves in that and to encourage a recording of it through oral history, through whatever means, so that people and their children and those of us that, to follow in the future can share that understanding of the circumstances in which we and our predecessors lived. There is a limited amount, not a great amount, already available in archives, but the challenge for the current generation is to ensure that we can capture as much oral history from our parents, and not in my case my grandparents, but I hope many of those watching this have still got grandparents living whose records they can record. And it's easy enough to do stuff on film, it's easy enough to do stuff by voice, and those of you who still wish to get out your pen and paper, I would urge you to do that for posterity and for the benefit of your own children in years to come.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Thanks for your time. So Out of Sight, Out of Mind, that's John's book. So if you're interested in this topic, you can get yourself one of his books, which is published and I believe available in like shops.
In all good bookshops.
There we go. But also it's at the Toynbee Hall Library. So if you want to pop down and come visit us at Toynbee, you're more than welcome to pop along, hang out in our library and access the book there. And also if you're interested in the topic and have reflections yourself, please get in touch. We'd love to hear from you. Or if you're interested in doing some research about some of your local history and would like some guidance or some support, you can also get in touch with us about that, and we're happy to have a chat. But other than that, we'll wrap up there. Thank you, John.
Well, thank you both very much. It's been a delight to be with you all. Thank you.